The candles in medieval palaces were rarely extinguished all at once. Instead, they faded one by one, leaving long corridors in half-light, where whispers traveled farther than footsteps. It was in those dim corridors, far from official chronicles, that reputations were born. Queens, more than kings, were judged not by their laws or alliances, but by rumor. And rumor, once spoken softly enough, had a way of surviving centuries. In medieval Europe, a queen's body was considered a political object. Her smile, her silence, her clothing, her fertility, and even her friendships were monitored with a suspicion that bordered on obsession. When a queen behaved outside expectation, when she laughed too loudly, rode too boldly, spoke too freely, or favored the wrong companion's, words like unnatural, corrupt, or perverted began to appear in monkish margins and court gossip alike. This story drifts through those whispered margins, not to judge, but to observe how medieval society defined scandal, and how queens became symbols of moral panic in an age afraid of female power. One such queen lived in France in the early 14th century, when silk dresses rustled louder than truth. Queen Isabella, later called the She-Wolf of France, was not accused of scandal because of any explicit deed, but because she refused to remain obedient. Chroniclers hinted at improper closeness with advisors, questioned her emotional loyalties, and used language heavy with suggestion. To medieval writers, a woman who conspired politically without her husband's approval was already crossing a moral boundary. They blurred ambition with indecency, power with perversion. At night, when the court slept, Isabella reportedly walked alone in palace gardens. That alone was enough to inspire stories. A queen was not meant to wander without escort. Her independence became a canvas upon which others painted their fears. Over time, the whispers grew thicker than facts, and centuries later, readers mistook condemnation for confession. In England, another queen lay under the weight of similar rumors. Eleanor of Aquitaine, intelligent and widely traveled, had seen more of the world than most men of her time. She spoke with poets, patronized musicians, and supported ideas that made churchmen uneasy. Her court was accused of indulgence, of loose behavior, of encouraging romance too freely. None of it was proven, but proof was rarely required. To medieval minds, a woman who encouraged art and conversation was already suspicious. Eleanor's supposed court of love became legendary, described as a place where rules bent and decorum softened. Over time, this transformed into tales of excess. The truth was quieter. A cultured queen in a brutal age appeared dangerous simply by contrast. As the night deepens, the story moves eastward, where Byzantine empresses lived behind veils of gold and silence. Empress Theodora's past was documented with cruelty by male historians who disapproved of her rise from poverty. They described her early life in theatrical terms meant to shock readers, then used those descriptions to discredit her reign. In their words, her former life never ended, no matter how wisely she governed. To fall asleep to Theodora's story is to hear how medieval writers weaponized morality. Once a woman was labeled corrupt. Every decision she made afterward was filtered through that label. Her laws were suspicious. Her mercy was manipulation. Her intelligence was seduction. In Spain, Queen Urraca ruled alone, something nearly unheard of. Her marriages failed, her authority was challenged, and her temperament was described as unstable. Chroniclers accused her of improper attachments and emotional excess. But beneath the accusations was a simpler discomfort. A woman ruling without male control unsettled the order of things. The language used against her was deliberately vague. Words like unrestrained and unnatural appear again and again. Medieval writers rarely needed detail. Suggestion was enough. A reputation once formed required no evidence, only repetition. As the candles burn lower, the story drifts into quieter corners of history, where lesser-known queens lived under similar shadows. A queen in Scandinavia accused of pagan habits. A consort in Central Europe rumored to practice forbidden rituals. A regent in Italy blamed for her son's cruelty. In each case, deviation from expectation became moral failure, and moral failure became scandal. Sleep comes easier when patterns emerge. Again and again, the so-called perversion of medieval queens was less about behavior and more about control. Queens were expected to be silent vessels of lineage, not active participants in politics, culture, or desire. When they failed to conform, language turned against them. Even acts of charity could be twisted. A queen who favored the poor too openly was accused of seeking admiration. One who dressed plainly was accused of hypocrisy. One who dressed richly was accused of vanity. There was no safe version of womanhood once power entered the equation. By the late Middle Ages, the Church's influence over reputation intensified. Confessors recorded not only sins but suspicions. Dreams, emotions, and unspoken thoughts were treated as evidence. Queens, constantly observed, became ideal subjects for moral storytelling. Their lives were turned into cautionary tales, told to frighten other women into obedience. As this long night continues, the story becomes slower, softer. The voices accusing these queens fade into murmurs. What remains is the realization that medieval scandal was often a mirror reflecting societal fear rather than individual behavior. The queens themselves are now dust. Their castles are ruins. But the labels assigned to them linger, repeated without context, misunderstood without question. To sleep with this story is to let those labels dissolve, to see them not as truth, but as echoes of a world deeply uncomfortable with women who did not disappear quietly. And so the candles finally go out. The quarters fall silent. The whispers lose their power in the dark. History rests for a moment, without judgment. The silence after the whispers is not empty. It is full of breath, of the slow turning of centuries, of the weight that finally lifts when no one is watching. In that silence, the queens who were once accused begin to feel less like scandals, and more like people who were trapped inside stories written by others. As night deepens, the mind drifts to Hungary, where Queen Gertrude of Marania was said to encourage excess at court. Chroniclers complained of foreign customs, unfamiliar laughter, and gatherings that felt too lively for a land accustomed to restraint. When she was later murdered, the stories hardened. Her death was described not as a crime but as a consequence, as if joy itself had offended the age. Medieval writers implied that indulgence invited punishment, and the word decadent followed her name long after her blood dried on stone floors. In Portugal, Queen Leonor Teles became a symbol of moral anxiety simply because she loved whom she chose. Her marriage was condemned, her influence resented, and her intelligence feared. The accusations against her were never precise. They didn't need to be. Suggestion was enough to turn public opinion into a weapon. To later generations she became a villainous figure, not because of proven acts, but because she challenged the neat boundaries drawn around queenship. Further north, in Scotland, Queen Margaret of Anjou English by birth, fierce by temperament, was remembered less for her political strategy than for her refusal to submit. Medieval poets painted her as cruel, unnatural, even monstrous. They spoke of her ambition as though it were a physical corruption. In an age when male violence was normal, a woman's decisiveness was described as perverse simply because it broke expectation. The language used against her was sharp but repetitive. Over and over, medieval texts returned to the same fears. Women who spoke too much, women who ruled too strongly, women who inspired loyalty in men. These were framed as moral failings, as signs of inner rot. The accusation of perversion became a convenient container for anything society could not comfortably name. As sleep grows heavier, the story slows further, almost like breathing. Each queen's name dissolves into atmosphere. What remains is a rhythm: rise, suspicion, condemnation, silence. It happened so often that it began to feel inevitable, as though medieval history itself required a fallen woman to balance every successful one. Even queens known for piety were not safe. A woman who fasted too intensely could be accused of pride. A woman who prayed too privately could be accused of secrecy. A woman who influenced religious appointments was rumored to manipulate desire rather than policy. Holiness itself became suspicious when worn by a crown. The chroniclers who wrote these accounts were often men who had never spoken privately with a queen. They observed from a distance, filtered everything through doctrine, and filled gaps with imagination. Over time, imagination hardened into reputation. Reputation hardened into truth, and truth, repeated often enough, stopped being questioned. Now, in the soft darkness of sleep, those old words begin to lose their edges. Perverted, once heavy with judgment, reveals itself as a shadow cast by fear. Fear of autonomy, fear of intelligence, fear of women who could not be easily controlled. The castles where these queens lived are quiet now. Wind moves through broken arches. Grass grows where thrones once stood. No one whispers anymore. No one watches. In this quiet, the queens finally rest without accusation, without labels, without the need to explain themselves. And as the story drifts toward stillness, it leaves behind a gentle understanding. Medieval scandal was rarely about behavior, and almost always about power. The night accepts this truth without argument, and sleep closes softly around it, like a curtain drawn at the end of a long, misunderstood play. The curtain does not fall all at once. It settles slowly, like dust drifting through moonlight, revealing more shapes before everything finally fades. And so the story continues, unhurried, unbroken, moving deeper into the long medieval night where memory softens and judgment loosens its grip. In the kingdoms along the Rhine, queens were watched not only by courtiers, but by sermons. Priests spoke from pulpits about order, obedience, and restraint, and every listener knew whom they meant. When Queen Brunhilde of Austrasia ruled as regent, her authority unsettled generations of men who preferred their rulers quiet and male. Over time, the descriptions of her rule shifted. Where once she was described as firm, she became cruel. Where once she was decisive, she became depraved. Chroniclers accused her of moral corruption without ever specifying acts, as if the accusation itself were proof enough. Her long life became suspicious. Her survival through political storms was treated as unnatural. Medieval writers preferred women who disappeared early, either into convents or graves. Longevity, especially when paired with influence, was interpreted as evidence of inner darkness. To fall asleep to Brunhilde's story is to hear how endurance itself could become a crime. Farther south, in Italy, queens and noblewomen moved through courts thick with intrigue. Here, rumor was currency. A queen who spoke privately with advisors was said to manipulate them. A queen who enjoyed music or poetry too openly was accused of indulgence. The line between culture and corruption was thin, and it shifted depending on who held the pen. One Italian queen, remembered mostly through hostile accounts, was described as surrounding herself with luxuries while the city suffered. Her love of art became vanity, her interest in philosophy became heresy. Even silence was dangerous. When she withdrew from public life, writers speculated about secret excess behind closed doors. In medieval imagination, unseen behavior was always worse than visible reality. As the night deepens further, the story drifts into Eastern Europe, where queens from foreign lands were married into unfamiliar courts. Their accents, customs, and clothing immediately marked them as other. When tensions rose, accusations followed. They were blamed for crop failures, for political unrest, for the moral decline of the court. Foreignness itself was framed as corruption. A queen from the steppes, raised among traditions older than the churches that judged her, was accused of bringing improper habits into a Christian kingdom. The chroniclers never explained what those habits were. They only insisted that they were wrong. Over time, her name became shorthand for excess, for disorder, for everything that frightened a rigid society encountering difference. Sleep listens without reacting. It understands that fear often disguises itself as morality. As hours pass, another pattern emerges. Kings accused of cruelty were remembered as strong. Kings accused of indulgence were remembered as colorful. Queens accused of the same were remembered as corrupted. Language itself tilted against them. Words were chosen carefully, sharpened to wound reputation rather than describe reality. Even motherhood offered no protection. Queens who struggled to conceive were accused of unnatural lives. Queens who bore many children were accused of uncontrolled bodies. Queens who loved their children too fiercely were accused of manipulation. Queens who mourned quietly were accused of coldness. There was no correct way to exist under constant scrutiny. The story becomes softer now, like a lullaby woven from repetition. Accusation, silence, reinterpretation. Accusation, silence, reinterpretation. Over centuries, this rhythm shaped how medieval queens were remembered far more than anything they actually did. In quiet moments, some queens wrote letters. Those letters, when they survive, sound ordinary. They worry about health, weather, politics, faith. They ask after children. They complain of loneliness. Reading them feels like hearing a human voice break through a wall of rumor. But letters were fragile things. Rumors were durable. As dawn approaches in this imagined medieval night, the accusations finally begin to lose their weight. The word perverted, so heavy in old texts, feels hollow now. It echoes without substance. It is revealed as a tool, not a truth. A way to discipline women through story when physical control was not enough. The queens fade gently into rest. Not redeemed, not condemned, simply allowed to exist without narration. Their lives, complex and constrained, dissolve into the quiet understanding that history was never neutral, and memory was never kind. The final candles burn out. The castles stand empty. No chronicler remains awake to write another accusation. In this stillness, sleep settles fully, and the story ends not with scandal, but with silence soft, forgiving, and finally free of whispers. Silence, once reached, does not always mean an ending. Sometimes it opens into a deeper quiet, the kind that stretches on without edges, where thoughts slow and drift like clouds that no longer know where they are going. And so the story continues, not louder, not sharper, but softer still. Beyond the written accusations and faded parchments, there were nights when these queens lay awake beneath heavy canopies, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of foreign courts. Owls outside stone windows, guards shifting their weight. The distant echo of prayers murmured in languages not their own. In those hours there was no scandal, no reputation, only fatigue, responsibility, and the steady pressure of expectation. One queen, remembered by hostile historians as indulgent, was known in private to suffer long illnesses. Her appetite, criticized by monks, was part of a struggle to keep strength in a body weakened by childbirth and travel. Another, accused of emotional excess, had been separated from her children for political reasons, a pain that medieval writers rarely acknowledged. Instead, they turned grief into suspicion, sorrow into moral failure. As sleep deepens, the story loosens its grip on names and places. Queens blur into one another, not as individuals accused of particular sins, but as figures caught in the same narrow frame. They were expected to embody virtue without voice, obedience without hesitation, and fertility without desire. Any deviation, however small, became a reason to whisper. In the colder regions of Europe, queens wrapped themselves in fur-lined cloaks, their movements restricted by both fabric and custom. Chroniclers describe their isolation as mysterious, their reserve as secrecy. Yet isolation was often imposed, not chosen. Silence was survival. Stillness was safety. And even then, stillness was misunderstood. Some queens turned inward, finding comfort in prayer or study. Others surrounded themselves with music, stories, and laughter as a defense against loneliness. Both responses were judged. Excess devotion was labeled fanaticism. Enjoyment was labeled corruption. Medieval morality allowed little space for human complexity, especially in women who ruled. The word perverted, when traced back through these stories, reveals itself again and again as an accusation without shape. It bent to fit whatever frightened the observer: intelligence, independence, foreignness, longevity, influence. It was never about acts alone, but about the discomfort of seeing a woman occupy space meant for men. The night grows heavier now, like a thick blanket pulled gently over thought. The queens no longer stand before courts or chroniclers. They sit quietly in gardens that no longer exist, or walk corridors that have crumbled into earth. Their lives, once dissected and judged, now rest beyond reach. History in this moment before waking feels less like a record and more like a dream itself, selective, distorted, shaped by fear and desire. And just as dreams fade when morning comes, so too do the sharp edges of these accusations soften with distance. There is no final verdict in this story. No redemption, no condemnation. Only the slow understanding that medieval queens were not remembered as they lived, but as others needed them to be remembered. Scandal was a language used to explain discomfort. Morality was a mask worn by power. As the last thoughts drift away, the queens finally sleep without watchers, without labels, without whispered judgments following them through stone halls. The night closes completely now, smooth and unbroken, and the story settles into rest, leaving behind only a calm, steady quiet where accusations no longer echo and history at last grows still. The stillness does not resist being extended. It welcomes length, the way night welcomes more night. Time stretches until it no longer measures anything, and the story moves forward without urgency, without sharp turns, without the need to arrive anywhere in particular. In that extended quiet, it becomes possible to imagine how history felt while it was happening, before it hardened into judgment. A medieval queen waking before dawn, not as a symbol or a scandal, but as a tired human being. Her chamber is cold. Stone always holds the memory of winter. Servants move quietly, careful not to meet her eyes too directly. Respect and fear are easily confused. She dresses slowly, layers of fabric that signal rank more than comfort. Each garment carries expectation. Each color has meaning assigned by others. Even before she speaks, she is interpreted. Even before she moves, she is evaluated. Later, centuries afterward, someone will describe her tastes as excessive, her preferences as suspicious, her influence as corrupting. But in this moment, she is only choosing what will help her endure another day of scrutiny. The medieval world did not allow women in power the luxury of neutrality. A queen could never simply exist. Every action required explanation, and explanation in the hands of hostile observers became accusation. When historians could not find fault in actions, they speculated about intentions. When intentions could not be proven, they hinted at desires, and when desire was implied, morality was invoked. Sleep listens patiently as this pattern repeats across kingdoms. In France, England, Spain, the German states, Scandinavia, the Byzantine court, different languages, same suspicions. Queens who laughed openly were said to lack modesty. Queens who avoided public display were said to hide secrets. Queens who intervened in politics were accused of manipulation. Queens who refrained were accused of weakness. The word perverted hovered above all of it, flexible enough to attach to any discomfort. Some queens attempted to control their own narratives. They commissioned religious works, funded monasteries, sponsored chroniclers friendly to their cause. But influence over one story was fragile. It could be undone by a single hostile monk, a single defeated noble, a single generation eager for moral tales. At night in this long drifting story, those hostile voices grow faint. What replaces them is repetition without tension. The soft clink of rosary beads, the distant sound of a lute, footsteps echoing in halls that have already begun to decay, even while occupied. Time was always eroding these places, even at their height. One queen, long accused of decadence, was known to spend hours listening to travelers describe lands she would never see again. Her curiosity was recorded as restlessness. Another, accused of moral corruption, kept exotic animals at court, symbols of diplomacy and wonder. Chroniclers turned curiosity into excess, wonder into indulgence. Foreignness was especially dangerous. Queens married across borders carried their childhood customs with them: food, music, gestures. What felt familiar to them felt threatening to others. Difference was framed as deviation. Deviation was framed as sin, and sin, once named, was difficult to erase. As the story continues, it becomes increasingly quiet, like snowfall. Accusations lose detail, names blur. The sensation of judgment fades into abstraction. What remains is a gentle awareness that these women lived under pressure few could endure without bending in some way. Bending was not failure, but medieval writers treated it as corruption. The church, the court, the chronicler, each demanded a version of queenship that was almost impossible to sustain. When reality failed to match the ideal, language stepped in to punish the difference. Moral vocabulary became a tool of discipline. Words like perverse, unnatural, and corrupt did not describe actions so much as enforce boundaries. Now nearing the deepest part of sleep, those boundaries dissolve. The queens are no longer measured against expectations. They are not wives, not symbols, not warnings. They are simply figures moving through time, constrained, imperfect, human. History loosens its grip. The heavy books close themselves, ink fades, stone crumbles. What once felt permanent reveals itself as temporary. The night remains, breathing slows, thoughts stretch and thin. The story no longer tries to explain or defend. It only exists, flowing onward in a low, even rhythm, like footsteps fading down a long corridor that leads nowhere and needs to lead nowhere. And so it continues gently, endlessly, without accusation, without urgency, just the quiet passing of time, carrying medieval queens not as scandals, but as distant silhouettes, finally free to rest in the dark where no one is watching anymore. The corridor stretches farther than expected, but there is no effort in walking it. The floor feels smooth, worn down by centuries of footsteps that once mattered greatly and now matter not at all. In this lengthened quiet, even memory grows tired of holding sharp shapes. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rings, not loudly, not urgently. It is the sound of routine rather than warning. Queens once lived by such bells. They marked prayers, meals, audiences, and sleep. Their days were segmented, controlled, and observed. Freedom existed only in brief intervals, often late at night, when even judgment seemed to grow drowsy. In those hours, queens sometimes removed their crowns and set them aside, if only symbolically. The weight on the head was real. Gold pressed downward, reminding them that power was never light. Chroniclers rarely wrote about this weight. They preferred to imagine indulgence rather than exhaustion. A queen in the Holy Roman Empire, remembered as morally questionable by later writers, was in reality a meticulous administrator. She reviewed accounts, oversaw estates, and negotiated on behalf of absent rulers. Her competence unsettled those who benefited from disorder. And so, when political winds shifted, stories followed. Efficiency became manipulation. Authority became corruption. The familiar pattern resumed, smooth and predictable. Sleep has a way of recognizing patterns and then letting them go. As the story drifts onward, the medieval world feels farther away, as though viewed through mist. Castles shrink. Courts quiet. Accusations lose their voices. Even the word that once dominated these stories, so harsh, so heavy, begins to sound meaningless, like a sound repeated too often to retain sense. Perverted. It was a word stretched thin by overuse. Applied to queens who loved learning, queens who loved influence, queens who loved silence, queens who loved nothing at all. It carried no single meaning, only disapproval. And disapproval, when examined in sleep, has no teeth. Some queens outlived their accusers. Others did not. But all eventually outlived the urgency of judgment. Time has a way of flattening outrage. What once felt scandalous becomes merely curious. What once felt dangerous becomes distant. The story slows further now, approaching that place where thought stopped trying to connect. Images come and go without explanation, a torch flickering against stone. A tapestry moving slightly in a draft. A woman standing at a window, looking out not because she wants something, but because looking out is the only direction that feels open. She is not a symbol here, not a warning, not a scandal. Just a figure breathing in cold air, existing between expectations. This is where history softens the most, where it stops insisting on lessons. The medieval world loved lessons. Every queen's life was turned into an example of what to be or what not to be. But sleep does not need lessons. It allows things to be unresolved. And so the queens remain unresolved here, neither innocent nor guilty, neither saints nor villains. Just human lives compressed by power, observed by fear, and remembered through distortion. The corridor finally fades into darkness that does not demand attention. There is no ending bell, no final judgment. Only the sense that everything which once felt sharp has been smoothed by time. Breathing slows again. The night holds. And the story continues not by adding more, but by letting go, by allowing the echoes of accusation, reputation, and rumor to dissolve into the same quiet that eventually takes all things. Nothing more is required. The dark is gentle, and rest deepens. The quiet does not end. It simply widens, like a lake without visible shore, and the story drifts across it without leaving a wake. Nothing presses forward, nothing pulls back. Time, here, has forgotten its duties. Somewhere beyond memory, a queen's name is spoken for the last time. It does not echo. It settles and disappears. Names once carried power, fear, accusation. Now they are only sounds that dissolve as soon as they form. The night does not hold on to them. In this softened space, the queens no longer stand apart from the world around them. They blend into it. Stone walls no longer judge. Tapestries no longer record victories or sins. Even crowns lose their meaning when no one is watching. Gold becomes just another metal, heavy and quiet. There were moments, rare, unrecorded, when queens felt almost invisible, sitting alone while a fire burned low, listening to rain strike narrow windows, watching dust turn slowly in a beam of light. These moments never made it into chronicles. They carried no moral weight, no lesson to teach. And yet, they were the truest parts of life. Medieval writers did not know how to write about stillness. They wrote about excess because excess felt explainable. Stillness felt threatening. A woman not easily interpreted invited speculation. So they filled silence with accusation, quiet with rumor, solitude with imagined vice. Sleep understands this instinct and lets it go. As the story continues, it becomes less about queens and more about the way history breathes: inhale judgment, exhale distortion. Over centuries, the rhythm repeats until the breath itself grows tired. When that happens, stories loosen. Meanings blur, certainty fades. In that fading, the queens are no longer held in rigid poses. They move freely now, unobserved. They walk through gardens without being interpreted. They speak without being quoted. They think without being translated into warning. One queen poses by a fountain that no longer exists. Another rests her hands on a table long since turned to ash. These images do not ask to be accurate. They ask only to be calm. The word that once weighed so heavily, the one that framed these lives in accusation, no longer fits here. It slides away, stripped of force, revealed as something temporary, something spoken loudly because silence frightened those who spoke it. Here, silence is safe. The story no longer tries to continue forward. It spreads outward instead, thinning like mist. Thought slows until it no longer needs to finish sentences. Images come softer, slower, further apart. A final candle goes out somewhere, not dramatically, just because it has reached the end of itself. Darkness does not rush in. It was already present, patient, waiting. There is no conclusion waiting beyond this point. No summary, no lesson, just rest. The queens remain, but without weight, without story, without judgment. And the night, wide and untroubled, carries everything gently onward until even the need for continuation fades, and only sleep remains. The continuation arrives almost without being noticed, like breath continuing after sleep has already taken hold. There is no effort in it, no direction, only a slow unfolding. In this deeper quiet, even the idea of history grows faint. The past no longer feels distant or heavy. It feels neutral, like a landscape after weather has erased all sharp edges. The queens, once burdened with meaning, are now simply part of that landscape, not central, not peripheral, just present. Stone floors cool beneath bare feet that leave no marks. Doors open without sound. The architecture of power, once rigid and commanding, becomes soft in memory. Towers no longer loom. They blend into the dark like silhouettes of hills. A queen sits somewhere, posture relaxed in a way she never allowed herself while awake and observed. Her hands rest loosely in her lap. There is nothing she must decide. Nothing she must defend. No audience waiting. The absence of expectation is almost unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Medieval life was loud with obligation. Bells, proclamations, judgments, prayers spoken aloud so others could hear sincerity. Even faith was monitored. Even virtue was evaluated. Sleep dissolves all of that. Here, sincerity does not need witnesses. The stories once told about these queens begin to unravel, thread by thread. Accusations lose context. Context loses urgency. Urgency fades into irrelevance. What remains is a simple awareness. People lived, were misunderstood and passed on. There is a calm honesty in that simplicity. Somewhere, a chronicler sets down his pen for the last time. He does not announce it. He is simply tired. The parchment remains unfinished, and in its unfinished state, it finally becomes truthful. No conclusion imposed. No moral attached. The queens are no longer framed by his words. The night continues to widen. It is generous with space. Thoughts drift farther apart now, like stars seen through thin cloud. You do not have to follow any single one. You can let them appear and disappear on their own. A distant wind moves through what used to be a great hall. It carries no voices. Only air moving where air has always moved. The idea of scandal cannot survive here. It requires attention, and attention has gone quiet. The body relaxes into stillness. The mind follows, slower than before. The story no longer adds images so much as it removes weight. Each moment subtracts something unnecessary. Reputation fades. Judgment fades. Even curiosity fades. What remains is rest. The queens are no longer queens here. They are not wives, symbols, warnings, or legends. They are simply figures resting in a shared human quiet beyond time, beyond language. The continuation does not push forward anymore. It settles. It lingers. It repeats the same soft truth without words. Nothing needs to happen. Nothing needs to be explained. Nothing needs to continue. And yet the calm persists, steady and unbroken, carrying everything gently downward into sleep, where stories no longer need endings and the night holds on without asking why. The calm remains unhurried, like a breath that forgets to end because there is no need for the next one yet. The story does not gather itself to move forward. It simply stays, and in staying, it continues. In this depth of quiet, even images grow faint. Shapes soften until they are more like feelings than scenes. A sense of space without walls. A sense of time without edges. The medieval world, once heavy with stone and ceremony, becomes light enough to drift. Somewhere far from courts and chronicles, a queen rests against a window ledge, not looking out, not looking in. The glass is cool. The night air is steady. She is not thinking of alliances or judgments. She is not wondering how she will be remembered. She is only aware of being awake inside a moment that asks nothing of her. Moments like this once existed, though no one wrote them down. They slipped between duties, between prayers, between the careful performances required of power. These moments were never perverted, never virtuous, never meaningful enough for history. They were simply human pauses. Sleep understands the value of pauses. As the story drifts on, the word that once anchored everything, the accusation that shaped these lives, has fully dissolved. It cannot survive here, where meaning is unnecessary and comparison has no place. Words need tension to stay alive. Here, there is none. The queens are no longer separate from the silence. They are part of it, like shadows that no longer belong to any object. Their stories do not conclude. They thin out, spreading until they are indistinguishable from the night itself. The idea of continuation changes. It no longer means adding. It means remaining in stillness, remaining in rest, remaining in a space where nothing is expected to resolve. A faint sound, perhaps wind, perhaps memory, passes through and is gone. It leaves no trace. The mind does not follow it. It does not need to. Everything that once demanded attention, scandal, reputation, morality, judgment, has gently stepped away. Not defeated. Just no longer relevant. The night is wide enough for that. Breathing is slow now, almost imperceptible. Thought barely forms before it fades. The story no longer narrates. It hums, low and steady, like a distant presence that reassures without speaking. There is nothing left to continue toward. Only something to continue within. And so it stays, soft, unmeasured, quiet, holding all those forgotten lives not as lessons or warnings, but as part of the same deep rest that eventually gathers everything and keeps it, without asking it to explain itself. The quiet holds its shape, as if it has always been this way and will remain so. There is no signal to begin again, so the continuation arrives gently, like warmth spreading through stone after a long night. Thoughts no longer line up. They drift. One fades before the next has fully formed. This is where stories lose their edges and become atmosphere. The medieval world, once crowded with expectation, is now spacious and forgiving. Somewhere within this stillness, a queen exhales and does not realize she has been holding her breath for years. The release is small, almost unnoticed, but it changes everything. Shoulders soften. The invisible weight of being observed slips away. No one is measuring her words. No one is interpreting her silence. This is the part history never captured. Candles are gone. Bells are gone. Even timekeeping has loosened its grip. There is only the sense of continuity without movement, like a river that has widened so much it feels like a lake. The queens, once separated by borders and centuries, are no longer distant from one another. They share this quiet without needing to speak. There is no rank here, no hierarchy, no comparison. Power has no use in rest. Memory itself begins to blur, not from loss, but from gentleness. Sharp moments soften. Pain becomes distant. Accusation becomes abstract. What remains is the simple fact of having lived. Sleep accepts that without commentary. A faint rhythm remains breathing, perhaps, or the echo of something that once mattered. It does not insist on attention. It is just there, steady and reassuring. Nothing new enters the story now. Nothing old demands to stay. The continuation is not about adding scenes or ideas. It is about sinking deeper into the same calm, letting repetition smooth everything into quiet. If there were walls, they would no longer matter. If there were names, they would no longer need to be remembered. If there were judgments, they would no longer have a place to land. The night is complete enough as it is. And so the story continues by resting, and rests by continuing, unbroken, untroubled, until even the sense of continuation dissolves, and only sleep remains, wide and gentle, holding everything without asking for more. The night stretches on, endless and patient, carrying everything in its soft embrace. There is no urgency now, no expectation of what must happen next. The story flows as a gentle current, and to follow it is simply to drift. In this space, even the queens of medieval courts are no longer separate entities. They dissolve into the quiet, becoming less like people and more like presence itself. The weight of crowns, robes, scrutiny, all the heavy layers of expectation fall away, leaving only stillness. There is nothing to defend, nothing to explain, nothing to achieve. Somewhere a window tilts open to the night air. A faint breeze moves across stone floors, across empty halls, across gardens that only exist in memory. It stirs nothing, leaves no trace. The breeze carries no accusation, no rumor, no judgment. Only cool calm and the soft rhythm of existence. In this vast quiet, the queens can simply breathe. Long-held tension eases. Shadows no longer threaten. The corridors, once filled with whispers and fear, now echo only with a deep, unmeasured stillness. Time too has loosened. Seconds do not matter. Hours do not matter. Centuries fold together like gentle waves merging into one endless sea. What once seemed monumental, the lives, the judgments, the history softens into texture, into pattern, into calm. The word that haunted their reputations, so heavy and sharp in chronicles and rumors, is now empty. It floats like a leaf on water, irrelevant and powerless. Nothing here demands it be remembered. Sleep holds everything tenderly. It does not ask for resolution. It does not insist on understanding. It only asks for presence, for letting go, for quiet continuation. The queens are no longer queens in the way anyone once needed them to be. They are simply figures in the night, figures in the gentle, unbroken stillness that stretches further than the eye can see. They do not move, they do not speak, they do not act. They simply are. And so the story continues without strain, without plot, without expectation. Continuation becomes the act of resting, and resting becomes the act of continuation. The night deepens, the air stills, and everything that once mattered drifts away, leaving only the soft, infinite presence of calm. Everything is held. Everything is still. And sleep, wide and gentle, carries it all onward. The quiet persists, endless and steady, folding the world into itself like a vast, soft cloth. There is no rush. There is no requirement. Only the slow, gentle movement of rest, carrying everything without effort. In this deep stillness, even the idea of history becomes distant. The queens, once caught in judgment and rumor, no longer need to exist as figures of morality or scandal. They dissolve into the calm, each one a soft outline in the darkness, breathing quietly, unobserved, free from expectation. Stone corridors stretch endlessly, yet there is no sense of distance. They are neither constraining nor expansive, they simply exist as part of the stillness. The walls themselves seem to breathe, or perhaps it is the air that does. There is no need to know. There is no need to follow. There is only presence. Somewhere, faintly, a breeze drifts through an open window. It carries no sound but the sense of passage time folding in on itself, centuries and moments mingling into one continuous, unbroken quiet. No footsteps follow it. No eyes watch it. It moves softly, leaving only calm in its path. The queens exist in this soft space without names, without titles, without judgment. They are simply forms, simply life that has moved beyond scrutiny. They sit, stand, or rest without story or obligation. The past, the chroniclers, the accusations, all of it falls away. What remains is simple, gentle, unmeasured. Even the word that once defined them, harsh, sharp, cruelly applied, is gone. It has no weight here. There is no one to say it aloud, no one to judge. Only quiet, only stillness, only the slow unfolding of night that has no need to end. Sleep has taken full possession now. The world, once loud with expectation, is silent, breathing slows, thought softens. Time thins until it is almost imperceptible. The queens no longer exist as stories. They exist as calm, they exist as rest. They exist as part of the infinite night that holds them without question, without interruption, without demand. And in this space the story continues in the simplest, deepest way. By simply being, by simply resting, by simply letting everything history, rumor, judgment, all the weight of the world fade into the wide, untroubled quiet of the night. The night continues, the calm continues, sleep continues. And all is held, softly, endlessly, peacefully. The night stretches on, limitless and patient, carrying the queens and everything they once were into a gentle, unbroken calm. Here there are no walls, no crowns, no expectations, only space that folds softly around presence itself. They move without effort, not as rulers, not as symbols, not as subjects of judgment, but as forms of life quietly existing. Every heartbeat, Every breath, every slow shift of thought is allowed without interference. There is no one to interpret, no one to accuse, no one to watch. Even the air seems to settle around them. It moves like a slow, invisible tide, carrying away tension, dissolving the remnants of centuries of rumor, and leaving only softness. Stone floors, empty halls, and once echoing corridors fade into memory. Nothing presses against the quiet. Time has no meaning here. Days and years lose shape. The events that once seemed critical alliances, betrayals, gossip flatten into an endless present. Everything that once demanded attention is now simply background, unneeded, and irrelevant. The queens are not separate from one another now. Borders, politics, and centuries dissolve. They share this calm, this expansive stillness like voices harmonizing into silence. They do not speak. They do not move. They simply exist, part of the soft expanse that holds them without strain. The word that once defined them, heavy with judgment and accusation, has completely faded. It cannot survive here, where thought has slowed to its quietest rhythm, where presence replaces meaning. Breathing itself becomes a lullaby. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. Each cycle is a gentle reminder that existence requires nothing more. Sleep does not demand narrative, nor does it require explanation. It only asks for letting go. And so the story continues endlessly, not through plot or event, but through the simple persistence of calm. The queens rest, and in their rest, history itself softens. The past no longer pushes against the present. The night continues, quiet and generous, holding everything in its infinite patience. No conclusion is needed. No ending is required. Only this, rest, soft and unbroken, carrying everything gently forward into the limitless, forgiving quiet of the night. The story continues in the space between breaths, in the pause between thoughts, in the gentle, endless folding of time into itself. And there, finally, all is still. The quiet continues, infinite and unhurried, like a slow river that no longer needs to reach the sea. There is no tension, no plot, no need for anything to happen, only the soft, steady unfolding of presence. The queens drift through this space without effort. Their lives, once tangled in crowns, ceremonies, and chroniclers' accusations, now loosen like threads in a gentle breeze. They do not remember their judgments. They do not anticipate observation. They simply are. Stone halls, towers, and gardens fade further into a kind of mist, becoming shapes without sharpness, echoes without volume. Even the sounds of the night, the wind through a broken window, the faint rustle of leaves, do not demand attention. They exist as part of the calm, unnoticed and unmeasured. Time, once rigid and relentless, has melted. Centuries fold together, like the pages of a book turned slowly by invisible hands. Past and present coexist without friction. The events that once seemed crucial alliances, betrayals, gossip, rumors dissolve into quiet continuity. The queens are no longer figures to be studied, labeled, or interpreted. They are simply forms in a vast stillness, moving or resting as naturally as the light drifts across an empty hall. Nothing can touch them here. No accusation, no expectation, no story demanding an end. Even memory softens. The sharp edges of history dull until they are no longer felt. All that remains is awareness, the simple, endless presence of life at rest. The heavy weight of reputation has fallen away. Only the calm remains. Breathing slows further, nearly imperceptible. Thoughts fade, one by one, like stars hidden behind a thin morning cloud. The story no longer moves forward because nothing needs moving. It simply exists as part of the quiet. The night stretches endlessly, carrying all things gently. The queens rest within it, not as rulers or symbols, not as warnings or examples, but as beings finally freed from the weight of observation and judgment. And in this gentle, infinite stillness, sleep deepens, embracing everything with patient, unbroken care. History, rumor, expectation, all dissolve. Only calm remains. Only rest. The story continues not by adding, not by explaining, but by simply letting go, carried onward by the quiet that holds everything without end. The quiet stretches farther, so vast that it no longer feels like night, nor day, nor any measure of time at all. There is no need for movement, no need for plot, no need for explanation. Everything simply exists, and in existence there is calm. The queens drift within this space, indistinct yet present, their forms no longer separated by centuries, borders, or history. Crowns have no weight, courts have no voice, judgments have no teeth. They breathe slowly, evenly, as if learning what it means to rest without fear or expectation. Stone walls, high towers, and gardens that once held ceremonies now exist only as shapes in the dark, soften and distant. Footsteps echo no longer, voices fade completely, and even memory itself bends to the rhythm of stillness. Time has melted into something fluid, gentle, and unending. Days, years, centuries, and moments are all the same here, folding into one continuous present. The events that once mattered, wars, alliances, betrayals, scandals, lose all significance. There is nothing left to prove, nothing left to witness, nothing left to fear. The word that haunted their lives, the one that carried centuries of accusation, has vanished. It floats and fades into the endless quiet, stripped of its power. Its echo cannot disturb the stillness here. Breath deepens and slows. Thoughts drift, appearing only to vanish again, leaving behind nothing but gentle awareness. The story no longer needs to be told. It continues simply by being a soft, persistent presence that asks nothing, demands nothing, and shapes nothing except rest. The queens are no longer queens in the sense of duty, scandal, or expectation. They are simply life existing in quiet. They sit, stand, walk, or pause without consequence. They feel the calm without needing to understand it. The night itself has become an embrace. It is wide, infinite, patient. It carries everything: the lives, the histories, the whispered judgments, without resistance, without judgment, without effort. And so the story continues endlessly and softly, not through events or words, but through the quiet persistence of being. The night holds everything. The queens rest in it, and sleep, deep and unbroken, carries all forward, gentle, infinite, serene. And in this space there is nothing left to do, nothing left to measure, nothing left to disturb. Only calm remains. Only rest, only the slow, endless unfolding of quiet. The quiet continues to unfold, deeper now, stretching without limit. There is no need for story, no need for memory, no need for explanation. Everything rests. Everything softens, everything dissolves into presence. The queens drift, no longer bound by time, place, or expectation. They are forms of life, unmeasured, unobserved, untroubled. Their crowns, their halls, their histories all have melted into the gentle fabric of this vast stillness. There is nothing to perform, nothing to defend, nothing to justify. Stone corridors and towers, tapestries and gardens, even the faint echoes of voices long gone, fade into the infinite quiet. Shapes blur, sounds vanish, and even thought slows to a rhythm almost too gentle to notice. Time itself has softened. Centuries and moments fold together, indistinct. The past and present exist together in a seamless calm. Events that once demanded attention, alliances, betrayals, judgments, scandals have no power here. They are like dust on a river, carried away and forgotten. The queens exist now in the simplest possible way, alive and quiet. They breathe slowly, evenly, without concern, without interruption. Each breath carries the weight of history away, leaving only the soft pulse of existence. Even the harsh words, the accusations that once shaped them, have disappeared. They no longer have meaning. They float and fade, leaving behind only calm, only rest, only the gentle persistence of being. The night stretches on, unbroken and infinite, carrying all things with it. There is no conclusion, no ending, no need for resolution. The queens are free of story, free of expectation, free of observation. And sleep continues, deep and wide, holding everything gently, without question, without demand. The calm persists, endless and soft, and everything drifts, unmeasured, into the vast, forgiving quiet of the night. The story continues not by moving forward, but by simply being, by simply resting, by simply letting the night hold all things in its infinite embrace. The night continues to stretch, vast and unbroken, carrying the queens deeper into a stillness that needs no shape, no narrative, no conclusion. Each breath flows evenly, each heartbeat quiets slowly, until it is almost indistinguishable from the rhythm of the dark itself. Here, there is no distinction between past, present, or future. Centuries fold over themselves, blending events, places, and lives into a seamless calm. The queens move gently within this endless night, but not with purpose. They drift like shadows softened by moonlight, or like figures glimpsed in a dream that cannot be pinned down. Their crowns, once heavy with expectation, lie forgotten. Their robes, once stiff with ceremony and authority, flow as if made of air. Their reputations, once sharp and unyielding, dissolve entirely. There is nothing here to judge, nothing to define, nothing to constrain. Somewhere far away, the sound of a distant stream begins to emerge, soft and rhythmic, carrying no meaning except itself. The queens feel it as a vibration through the quiet, a gentle reminder of presence and continuity. Their forms lean into the stillness, moving with the slow current of calm. Each movement is unobserved, each thought is unexamined, and each moment exists without urgency. Stone walls, tapestries, and empty halls begin to fade into a kind of mist, losing their solidity and significance. The corridors that once echoed with whispers, accusations, and footfalls are now just space. Space that holds the quiet, space that makes room for the slow pulse of life itself. Time continues its soft collapse. Years and decades, events and rumors, all fold together and lose their importance. What once seemed monumental political alliances, whispered scandals, accusations, rebellions now feels distant, like clouds moving slowly across a pale sky. Nothing presses against the calm. Nothing requires attention. The queens no longer exist as rulers, symbols, or lessons. They exist only as forms within the quiet, their awareness a gentle rhythm moving alongside the unbroken night. They sit beside fountains that have become still pools of reflection. They wander through gardens that bloom only in memory. They pause in corridors where no one waits. Each gesture is simple, necessary only to exist, and yet it is enough. The heavy word that once labeled them, accusation, moral judgment, fear, has long since faded. It floats like a feather and drifts away, leaving nothing behind. The night-wide impatient takes the rest of the weight. The air itself carries the softness, filling every corner with calm. Breath deepens and slows further, until even thought thins into quiet shapes that are felt more than understood. Sleep thickens around them, a wide, steady presence that requires nothing, explains nothing, judges nothing. Every heartbeat, every sigh, every motion flows seamlessly into the vast stillness. History, rumor, morality all have lost their grip. Only life persists, quiet, soft, patient, infinite. The queens are no longer separate from the night. They are part of it. The corridors of memory, the towers of expectation, the halls of judgment all dissolve. Only presence remains. And so the story continues, not with events, not with words, not with consequence, but as the unbroken, gentle persistence of calm. The queens rest, the night stretches, and sleep carries everything onward, wide, endless, serene, and free from all weight. Each breath, each pause, each gentle movement of thought is a continuation, a small, quiet ripple in the vast ocean of stillness. Time no longer matters. Story no longer matters. Only the endless, tender unfolding of night remains, holding everything softly, infinitely, without end. The stillness stretches farther, becoming a vast expanse where the queens and everything that once defined them, titles, judgments, stories, scandals, dissolve completely. The air is heavy with calm, yet light enough to move through effortlessly, carrying everything gently without needing to hold it. Their forms drift slowly, not with purpose but with presence. They are unbound by chronology, expectation, or obligation. Centuries fold into one another, leaving only the soft, unbroken now. The events that once mattered, alliances, betrayals, accusations, fade like echoes of a distant storm, leaving no mark, no urgency, no consequence. The queens no longer carry crowns, robes, or the weight of observation. They exist simply, as beings breathing quietly within infinite space. Their gestures are minimal, their movements soft, like shadows shifting in the slow glow of moonlight. There is no one to notice, no one to judge, no one to record. Stone corridors, towers, and gardens once, sharp with meaning, blur into shapes that are felt more than seen. Halls that once echoed with whispers and footsteps are now only emptiness, holding the gentle rhythm of quiet. Even the air seems to pulse with this calm, carrying away the remnants of history, rumor, and expectation. The word that once labeled them harsh, heavy, destructive has dissolved completely. It floats, weightless, and disappears into the vast expanse. There is no need for explanation, no need for justice, no need for understanding. Only the persistent, patient presence of being remains. Breath slows further, deepening into a steady rhythm that is almost one with the night itself. Thoughts dissolve into feeling, into soft awareness, into the quiet pulse of existence. Sleep thickens around them, wide and forgiving, carrying away everything that ever demanded attention or action. The queens are no longer individuals of scandal or story. They are simply life existing in quiet, moving gently through the soft, infinite night. Every heartbeat, every pause, every gentle motion merges with the vast stillness. History, expectation, judgment, all are absorbed into the calm, leaving nothing but presence. Time has no meaning here. Space has no edges. The night holds all things effortlessly, infinitely, endlessly. The queens rest in it, part of its expanse, their forms and awareness merging with the quiet that stretches without end. And so the story continues, not through events, not through words, not through consequence, but through the slow, infinite unfolding of calm. Breath follows breath, thought follows thought, and the night carries everything onward, gentle, vast, serene, and unbroken until all that once was fades fully into the wide embrace of sleep. And so at last the night reaches its deepest point, carrying all that once existed, the queens, their histories, their reputations, and their whispered scandals into a quiet so vast it needs no words, no judgment, no conclusion beyond itself. The crowns lie forgotten, the halls lie empty, the voices of chroniclers and accusers dissolve like mist in morning light. Time no longer matters. Centuries and moments fold into one endless present. The queens are no longer queens in the sense the world once demanded, they are simply life at rest, figures of presence and calm, drifting gently in the infinite expanse of night. Breath flows steadily, evenly, unbroken. Thoughts soften and fade, leaving only awareness. Sleep, wide and patient, holds everything without question, without interference, without expectation. The heavy weight of history, rumor, morality, and scandal has vanished. Nothing presses, nothing judges, nothing requires attention. The story, which once sought to record lives, to define them, to measure them, ends not with conclusion, but with quiet. It ends in calm, in rest, in the soft, infinite embrace of night that carries all things gently onward. And in that calm, everything exists in peace. The queens rest, the night holds. Sleep continues, nothing more is needed, all is still. All is quiet. All is free.